Hi, listeners of the History of the Papacy podcast. My name is David Cott, and I'm the host of the History of Spain podcast, a bi-weekly podcast to learn Spanish history in a chronological order. I'm here to introduce you these two episodes on the secular and Christian history of Spain up to the Muslim conquest. And why is it important to learn that? Why does the history of pre-Roman, Roman, and Visigothic Spain matter? For modern Spain, there are very relevant and influential events that happened during that long period before the Muslim conquest. The cultural and linguistic Romanization has lasted to this day in Spain. And the Christianization of the Iberian Peninsula happened in the Hispania under the Roman Empire. On the other hand, the memory of the Visigothic kingdom has been tremendously influential for the history of Spain, because medieval Christian kings used that to legitimize their conquests and eventually unite politically and religiously the Iberian Peninsula. Therefore, it's important to understand all these aspects before you study anything that happened afterwards in the Iberian Peninsula. So listen very well to what Steve has to say, and subscribe to the History of Spain podcast if you want a more detailed narration of Spanish history. Thank you all for listening, and I leave it to you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm Steve, your host for this podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We are on Facebook and Twitter. You can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I, of course, have to mention David Cott's History of Spain podcast, who provided an introduction to both this episode and the last episode. If you want to learn much more about the deep and fascinating history of the great land of Spain and Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula, you will love David's wonderful podcast. Find out how to subscribe to his podcast in the show notes. I will quickly mention that if you are listening to this episode in June of 2020, the Intelligent Speech Conference is just around the corner. It will be in an online format for a variety of reasons you might be able to suspect. I won't be able to participate this year, but it should be a really fun time, and you can go to Agora Podcast Network to find out how to register. I'd like to also send out two really big thank yous today. I want to thank Terry for his kind and generous PayPal donation, and I would also like to send out a million thank yous, always thank yous, to my great friend Antonio for his excellent reading of the primary source quotations in this episode. Last episode, we discussed the political history of the Iberian Peninsula up to and just past the Islamic conquest. This time, we are going to zoom in on the Christian history of the area of modern-day Spain and Portugal up to the same point in history. The Iberian Peninsula may be a long way from the land where Christianity was founded, but it would become a heartland of the religion. Let's find out why, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so our last episode was a brief overview of the history of Hispania, or the Iberian Peninsula, up to the 8th century, the 718 to be specific. And the focus of that episode was on the political and the secular history of that section of the Roman Empire. For convenience sake, we use the terms Spain, Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, and we used Spain pretty much interchangeably for Hispania, kind of ignoring that Iberian Peninsula is broken up into four distinct political units today. But that being said, so I got a little lazy with that. But if I do use Spain, I am generally using kind of an anglicization of the Hispania, for the larger Iberian Peninsula. But anyways, the Iberian Peninsula really was a diverse place, both demographically and geographically. And as we learned last episode, it had a very interesting and complex history. The focus for today's episode is going to be the religious and particularly the Christian history of Hispania up to the 8th century. So we start off with the Romans, obviously. I mean, where else do you start off with in any of these episodes? There was the usual mix of Greco-Roman paganism throughout the peninsula, with some lingering Celtic traditions that stayed even into the Middle Ages and beyond, as well as the Basques, who held on to their own traditions even as they slowly became Romanized and Christianized. The very first mention of Hispania or Spain in a Christian context goes very, very far back. Spain is specifically mentioned by Paul, as in St. Paul fame, in his letter to the Romans. Paul was writing from Greece to the church in Rome, the actual city of Rome. He said he was going to visit Rome on his way to set up a church in Spain. And again, he's using Spain, as I did, as a generically for Hispania. He says in the epistle to the Romans, or the letter to the Romans, chapter 15, verse 20, quote, "And so I have made it my aim to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build on another man's foundation." So there's a really clear inference that there wasn't an organized church in Roman Hispania at this point in the mid-50s AD. This is a letter of Paul that is without question his own. A lot of the other ones, as we learned in our episode with Bar Ehrman, and we've discussed with Gary, there are letters of Paul that scholars question, but this one, the scholarly consensus is that this is a genuine letter of Paul, and it can be dated to the mid-50s AD. And it's clearly not an after-the-fact backdating or anything like that. Another inference that can be drawn is that there may have been some Christians in Hispania, but that they just weren't organized at this point. Where Paul was going in Greece, even at this very earliest time in the 50s AD, there were organized Christian churches and Christian meeting houses. In Rome, there was organized Christian meeting houses. Obviously, back in Jerusalem and Damascus, there was organized meetings there. One other thing is Paul may have also been going to spread the good news to the Hellenized Jewish diaspora that was in Spain at this time. The Hellenized Jewish diaspora was all over the Roman and Persian empires and beyond at this point. We don't know exactly how populous they were on the ground, but there's no doubt in the big cities in Hispania there was a Jewish population. Now, Christianity almost certainly spread to Hispania the way it did from Russia to Britain to China to Egypt, India, and beyond. It was brought on the trade routes to the cities. It spread among Hellenized Jewish populations who had already had a flavor of what these early Christians were, what they were, I mean, for lack of a better word, what they were selling, what they believed. They were groups that were already familiar with the basics of where Christian theology came from. It was a Second Temple Judaism, which they were all steeped in. For all this, though, not much was written about the early spread of Christianity in Hispania besides those bare-bones reports in the Epistle to the Romans. Now, there was very good but almost without a doubt, completely untrue story about the Christianization of Spain, which is the story of Santiago. According to tradition, Hispania was proselytized by St. James the Greater, who was one of the 12 apostles. Now, I've talked endlessly about the other famous James the Apostle, just many, many times in this podcast. Gary and Stevens and I have discussed James the Just, or James the brother of Jesus, often. I mean, I think we did at least one full episode about him, and he came in and out on several other episodes, both collaborations with Gary and with just me. But believe it or not, in Western Latin Catholic tradition, the James that we've known and loved in our podcast, James the Just, is not very well known, and he's called James the Lesser. The James who was supposed to have gone to Spain is called James the Greater, or James the son of Zebedee. Just to recap, just to keep our two Jameses separate, the James the Just that we've spoken much about, who was the president of the Council of Jerusalem very early on from the book of Acts, he is very well known and a big name in Eastern Christianity. There's the liturgy of St. James. He's a very big deal, but he really is almost completely unknown in the West, and really Western theologians were very uncomfortable with the brothers of Jesus, or the brethren of Jesus, of which whom James the Just is, James the brother of Jesus. Anyways, let's get back to this new James, who's definitely a bigger James in the West, and this James son of Zebedee. His dad, of course, was Zebedee, and I apologize if Zebedee slips out. But his name is James, son of Zebedee, who was a fisherman in the Galilee. According to some biblical sources, he may have been not just a regular old fisherman. He may have had a couple of extra bucks to spare, and he was at least a prosperous or semi-prosperous fisherman around the Sea of Galilee region. His brother, John, the son of Zebedee, was purported to be the author of the Epistle of John and of Revelation, a.k.a. John the Evangelist. James became an original apostle with his brother John. This is the famous "I will make you fishers of men" scene from the Gospels. More to James, we'll have to talk about him with Gary's at some point, but he was known to have a temper, and Zebedee means thunder or lightning in Aramaic, and so he was James, the son of thunder, which also spoke to maybe that he had a temper. That temper may have played a role in his own martyrdom. According to the books of Acts, he was killed by Herod Agrippa after having a big blowout with them. And all this happened in Jerusalem. So what the heck does James the Greater, a guy who, according to Christian scriptures, died in Jerusalem, have to do with the founding of Christianity in Spain? Well, in reality, very little, but I guess you might want to call it a mythology or a legend sprang up, which says that James came to Hispania during the years between Jesus' crucifixion and his own death. He set up a church there, then went back to the Holy Land, to where he was eventually martyred. Eventually, his relics, or his body, was translated back to northwestern Hispania, particularly the city of Santiago de Compostela, which is in the northwestern quarter of the peninsula, particularly in Galicia, Hispania. Obviously, this story has enough holes to start a PGA golf course. First, there's no contemporary or early church document to say James was ever in Spain. Second, Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius of Caesarea state James never left the environs of Jerusalem after the time of Jesus. Like, they're really specific about it. Clement of Alexandria, not too long after the times of Jesus, and Eusebius of Caesarea, maybe 200 years later. You're talking about sources that aren't super close, but pretty close to what was going on. Third, we have that pesky letter of Paul to the Romans. Paul said he didn't want to build a church on anyone else's foundations. And an apostle who started a church would definitely qualify as foundations. Now, the fourth hole, so to speak, of the James the Greater in Hispania narrative is this is not mentioned at all in writing until the 900s AD. And it's an oral tradition that maybe goes back to the 600s at the earliest. Spain isn't true. Where would this story possibly come from? Originally, there were purported to be relics of James in Toulouse, which isn't impossible. Relics did make their way far and wide during Europe. Even in this early time, relics were moving around. Now, interestingly enough, the Visigoths' original capital was in Toulouse. Compostela is on a major trade route, the Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James pilgrimage route, that basically cuts through the Pyrenees, and it has feeder routes that come from southern France, in which Toulouse is located, and make their way into northern Hispania. Now, Hispania did not have a true apostolic foundation. So the question is, why not just make them up? The Hispania wasn't the first place to do it. It's in very good company. Constantinople also had one. Carthage and others had one as well. Apostolic foundation was a big deal. Every city or region of any import really wanted to have its church to be founded by an apostle. Paul didn't get to Hispania as planned, so you got to find someone else. And St. James, as somebody who fought back, he's a great symbol to use in the Reconquista, which is coming down the line. Also, if we look at Compostela, it's in that northwestern quadrant of Hispania that would become the Kingdom of Asturias, the first Spanish or old Visigothic kingdom that would wrest control away from the Muslims and start the Reconquista. So it really is in a perfect location to solidify and be the big bang to start this new thing. There's a lot of great narrative use of everything about the Santiago story. Now, going back into a more firmer timeline, as we've said, there's not too many records of the pre-Constantinian Christianity in Spain. So like pre-early 300s Spain, Christianity in Spain, there's just not a ton of info on it. But we have little bits and pieces. There is one thing, Vocis or Osius of Cordoba. He was the bishop of Cordova, and he attended the Council of Elvira, which was a really interesting council, and it was attended by 19 bishops from around Hispania, and it's considered a regional synod, and synods were quite common and really were supposed to be held regionally on a regular basis. 19 bishops in attendance means that there was a reasonably well-developed episcopal structure in Hispania in the early 300s. You figure Hispania geographically isn't a huge area, and to have 19 bishops who were at the very least in attendance, that's not to say that there weren't more bishops in the peninsula, that's a decent representation that even if it was only 19 bishops in Hispania, the place was pretty well covered with Christians, especially saying that Christianity was not heavy on the ground at this point. The dating of this council is particularly interesting. It could have been as late as 324, so basically on the eve of the Council of Nicaea, but it could have been as early as 300, a couple of years before the Diocletian persecution even began. A few years either way, the council, when it was happening, it could have been very different circumstances and very different context playing on there, right? That would have really, it changes how we think about it. The council had many canons on a wide variety of topics. Two specific canons really come to mind that are really important for Western Latin Christianity in the history of the popes, but we'll go through a couple of canons on this one because they're really good. First, there was a canon on clerical celibacy, the earliest written church canon on the need for priests to be celibate, meaning that they would not engage in sexual relations, so to speak. At this point, all throughout the Christian world and Christianity, bishops were married. They had kids often enough. Priests were married all the time. There was also a canon that could be read against the use of sacred art in church, which is really interesting. And the canon, which is Canon 36, says, pictures are not to be used in places in church so that they do not become objects of worship and adoration. And much ink has been spilled on this canon. Fights over the accuracy of the translation of the Latin text have been used. Maybe the canon was meant to simply be against newly baptized pagans worshiping sacred art, such as they did with pagan idols. Also, it was maybe a defense against Arianism, which was building steam at this time. But it also could have been that maybe Christians in Hispania were actually iconoclasts and didn't want to use sacred art. I mean, there were, from stem to stern in Christianity, a million different ways that people practiced the religion. And this could have been a very early iconoclast tradition popping up. Later people, like much, much later people such as John Calvin and other Protestants who were iconoclasts just ran with this as an early support and evidence from the early church fathers that were against decorating churches with sacred art. The iconophile Christians of that time and the later times said, who cares? Really, like this means nothing. A regional council in Spain, Hispania, in the early 300s doesn't trump the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787 that was completely all for icons. And really an ecumenical council trumps a regional synod every day of the week and twice on Sunday. It's just not up for debate. So you have that really interesting dynamic going on there. Now, I did say that the Council of Elvira had canons on many different topics. I mean, they had a canon for anything you could think of. So I got to give you a sampling of just a few here. Canon 12 is about a mother pimping and whether she can take communion. So that must have really been happening. Mothers who were pimping out prostitutes were happening in Hispania, and it was a question of they were coming to take communion. Could they do it? Canon 34 excommunicated someone for lighting a candle in a cemetery during the day. Canon 44 says that women who were prostitutes but who gave up the profession and wanted to become Christians didn't have to do anything special or any special penance for that. I mean, usually there was a penance for everything and any sort of pre-Christian indiscretion, but apparently not for this one. Canon 52 banned handing out pamphlets in church. The pamphlets were only concerned over certain popular satirical pamphlets, apparently, and only pre-approved official Christian pamphlets were able to be passed out. Canon 60 said that any Christians who destroyed an idol, that they, and if they were put to death by the civil authorities for breaking the idols, shouldn't be considered martyrs. Now, that is interesting because destroying property is against the Gospels, and that's what the church fathers taught. So really, these people were considered, even though they were breaking idols and destroying them, if they weren't doing it in a prescribed way, without the being condoned by the church, and it just so happened that they were caught and tried, then put to death for it, they were not martyrs for that. So that's an interesting one. Canon 3 is against abortion if a woman conceives a child during an adulterous affair. So that's an interesting one. There is Canon 67 that women shouldn't go to hairdressers. I've tried to use that canon, but my wife isn't buying it, and she's still going to the hairdresser. But there was 81 canons from this one council, and they addressed very specific situations, and these things must have been happening, and they must have been of concern. Now, let's just circle back around. Let's not leave Vocis of Cordoba yet. He somehow or another became really close to Constantine the Great. He was actually the president of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Some say he was put in that place by the Pope, but I don't see that as likely. The Pope had 2 representatives there. And Constantine would have wanted someone he could trust in charge of the council. Afterwards, Vocis went back to Cordoba to continue to be bishop. He signed a questionable and likely heretical statement, but he's said to have recanted that. And he was still respected by greats like Athanasius of Alexandria. We also have the Emperor Theodosius, who was from Hispania, and he was a huge Nicene Christian. He went to the east to help take care of the Visigoths. It's really interesting how Theodosius of Hispano-Roman went to the east to fight the Visigoths, and then the Visigoths wind up coming to the west. It's a whole twisted story. It's really awesome. Let's quickly talk about a really major figure who was from around this time, or give or take, named Priscillian. He was covered in Sidetrack episode 29 in depth. The really short story was that he lived in this late 300s time period. Early 400s, he preached some very unusual ascetical practices, which were seen as heretical by his hierarchy of bishops. Despite that, he was really popular, and he did become the Bishop of Avila, which is just about right smack dab in the middle of the Iberian Peninsula. He was tried for sorcery, which an important notice is he was not tried for heresy. He kind of went under the radar for the heresy, but the Roman government wanted to make a big deal of him. The emperor at that time thought, hey, man, if I can sidle up to these Christians by putting this guy Priscillian on trial, and he put him on trial for sorcery, which, believe it or not, was a Roman civil crime, which was punishable by death. Priscillian was convicted of sorcery and put to death for that crime. The church at this time really didn't have any tools to use besides anathema or excommunication to deal with troubles within the ranks. Really, that's been the church's only tool, unless they were connected to civil authorities, which could use civil crimes and civil punishment. Many of the biggest names in the church at that day were very angry about it. People like Martin of Tours, Ambrose of Milan, etc. They were completely against the civil government butting into and imposing their will on church officials. Priscillian's movement hung on for quite some time, really up until the 900s in small pockets in Hispania, so it did have pretty decent staying power, and this whole episode was really a very big deal in Christian history. Things really heat up in the 400s with the arrival of the Germanic barbarians. This is when Arianism comes back around again. First, we'll talk about the Vandals, the Alans, and the Sueves, or the Suebies. They were the first Germanic barbarian groups to come to Hispania. Most often, Germanic tribes were a mix of Christian and pagan Germanic religions, and most of as they were Christians, they were subordinationist Christians. Arianism was considered by that point a heretical or heterodox as compared to the Roman Orthodox Church. The local population in Hispania in the 300s was primarily Roman Imperial Trinitarian Christian Church. Now, I could go on for hours and hours about the differences in the history of Arianism and subordinationist theology versus Trinitarian theology, and I have an entire series dedicated to the Council of Nicaea, the Arian Century series, and an entire episode dedicated just to Wolfilas. It's just scores of hours of fun. If you're new to the show and are interested in how the Germans became Arian and the Romans did not, go back and listen to those episodes. And maybe Nick Barksdale might turn a few of those into videos. In short, though, a group of Goths lived on the border north of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. They went on raids into Greece, Thrace, and Anatolia and beyond. This was really beginning as early as the mid-200s. It's the very beginnings of this Germanic Great Migration period. As raiders of the day were wont to do, they took slaves. Many of these slaves were Greeks and Christian. Orthodoxy wasn't solidified yet in the early 200s and into the late 200s. Christianity was in fact still illegal in the Roman Empire. A wide spectrum of belief and theology was available. There was a buffet of options, anywhere from Jesus was a great man to Jesus was actually God the Father in the shape of a man. Theology and Christology was crystallizing that Jesus was both a man in time and a divine being. Nobody was really too concerned about dogma at this point in time, and if they weren't really arguing over it too greatly. A great diversity of opinion existed, but not too much argument. That would change immensely in the next 50 years or so. Also, there was a great diversity in practice. There were many local liturgies or mass styles, different language preferences, different canons to a lesser degree, and chant style and art. There was just anything you could possibly imagine was really in play at this time. Christianity began seeping into the Gothic culture north and east of the Roman Empire. In the early to mid-300s, a major missionary movement to the Goths began. And that's where Wolfilas, or Ulfilas, the little wolf in Gothic, began. He translated the Bible into Gothic, and he even invented an alphabet for Gothic based off of the Greek Koine or Kine alphabet. Wolfilas was the student of Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was a major Arian is such a loosey-goosey term. He was a subordinationist Christian. He didn't believe entirely in the Trinity as it would come out of really the Second Council of Constantinople in 381. No matter what he believed, Christianity spread like wildfire among the Germanic and Gothic barbarians. The Council of Nicaea and subsequent councils developed specific dogmas and doctrines. The church inside the Roman Empire rejected the theology that the Goths and the Germans outside of the empire ultimately adopted. For all that to be said, the Visigothic Christianity was not an extreme version of subordinationism, unlike, say, positions like eunomianism, which isn't really important to know about right now. Really, theologically, the theological or spiritual fathers of Arianism essentially agreed with the First Council of Nicaea in 325. They just looked at it through a slightly different lens. The Visigoths were likely highly Christianized at this point. Almost no pagan practices are found in their cemeteries and in their burial rituals. And burial rituals, let's be honest here, it's where the rubber hits the road, where you're most likely to see vestiges of old cultural ways. People and those they left behind want to cover all their afterlife bases. I mean, you'll see this today often enough. An atheist will have some religious customs sneak into their burials, or oftentimes those customs will sneak into things like weddings and marriages. Maybe the person who died, they didn't necessarily want that snuck in there, but maybe the families just do it for their own comfort. Like I said, they're the ones who are most concerned about the afterlife well-being of that dead person, and they sneak it in there to make themselves feel better. There is an odd example in a Visigothic cemetery where a younger child is buried with an iron bar through their chest. This could be from any number of reasons. It could have been a pagan custom that stuck around and was Christianized. We see this happening all the time. In Europe to this day, people go to church, and even in the U.S., to go get holy water to bring in, and they might be people who never go to church. And then they go and they give this holy water to the local witch to turn it into folk remedies. The old woman is almost always as devout of a Christian as anybody in the town, and probably more so. And she doesn't think of herself making these witch potions as anything outside of Christianity. The priest and the hierarchy, they might not love the use of the sacred in this way, but it also isn't worth the fight, because the grandma witch she's sitting in the front pew every Sunday, and why make an enemy of her? But so this iron bar burial through the child's chest may have just been a one-off too. We just don't know, but there does sure seem like there's something to it. By this point, the Romans living in Hispania were quite Christianized themselves. There were some vestiges of paganism always in the background. Like I said earlier, certain pre-Roman Celtiberian practices worked their way into Christianity in Spain for many centuries into the medieval era. Celtic Christianity and the background on that's going to come very soon. And believe it or not, it's going to sneak into... We're going to probably have at least part of an episode on Celtic Christianity in northern Spain. I just can't get enough of Celtic Christianity. Can't get enough of northern Spain either. As we have seen today, Christianity was very well developed in places like the cities. Different story outside the walls. There's still a lot of vestiges of paganism and a wide variety of ideas. Even in the cities, there was various instances of religious syncretism. Thursday, Jupiter's Day in Latin, was considered a holy day. Bishops worked hard to stamp out this one and other syncretisms, but there was always a push and a pull on this. There was also a really big push to evangelize and baptize in the countryside. One more group in Hispania that bears mentioning is the Basques. In the 400s, they were probably very little Christianity amongst the Basques. Christianity started to spread widely in the Basque lands in the 500s and the 600s. It was not really fully Christianized until possibly as late as the 900s and into the first millennium AD. And with all of that, many native Basque traditions held on. Basques outside of the Basque counties, though, they became absorbed into Roman and Christian language and culture over time, and much more quickly than the Basques who were up in the highlands and up in the mountains of what would be considered Basque land today. Now, there were some other groups that came to Hispania. We talked about the Suabes. They came in the early 400s, and they were actually originally Catholic Trinitarian Christians who would, throughout that century or so, convert to Arianism, possibly to make the Visigoths happy. The Visigoths had active missionaries to Germanic groups they wanted to tie the Germanic Gothic nobilities together. The Ostrogoths had similar ideas for their kingdom. The Ostrogoths really wanted a pan-Gothic empire, which included the Visigoths, the Burgundians themselves, and some other groups. Believe it or not much happened as far as religion during the 400s and into the 500s. The Visigoths had a hands-off attitude towards Catholic Christians. The main reasons were there was way too many Catholics in Hispania to ever have a chance in really widely converting them. Remember from the last episode, the Germanic overlord aristocracy class was maybe 5% of the population. Goths, as a rule, wanted to maintain their separateness from the Romano population. Separate laws, limited intermarriages, keep their own language and customs, and, of course, Arian religion as much as possible. But at this point, Germanic Arianism was not a completely alien religion to Catholicism. It was much closer in relations than, like we said, more stricter forms of subordinationism. That's why this type of Arianism gets called semi-Arianism. There were a couple of Arian councils that were important in Hispania. At times, Arians in Hispania tried to make it easy for Catholics to become Arian. If you can't drag them over, why not just let them slide over? One thing that was not easy was that the Arians said that Catholics needed to be rebaptized to become Arians. And this, for some reason, really got the Catholics mad. Arians saying Catholic baptism was not good enough really tweaked them. Arians did not tend to be needed to be rebaptized in most cases to become Catholic. The Catholics were pretty loosey-goosey about that. There were some conversions to Arianism among the regular people. Not much conversion among the clergy. There were some notable conversions of Catholic bishops to Arianism, and obviously that made a really big stink. Catholics were not happy about this at all, and it was very bad optics, even though they weren't mass conversions. Catholics were, for the most part, free to do whatever they wanted within Hispania and under the Visigothic kingdom. They were even able to evangelize among non-Christians and even among Arians. In many cases, Visigoths were more worried about their own internal squabbles. The Visigoths they were just constantly infighting, but things would change. Particularly, we'll talk about two kings, the same two kings we talked about in the last episode, Leovigild or Leovigild and Recared. Leovigild was the king of the Goths from 570 to the 580s. He's seen as a great persecutor of Catholics. Previously, like we said, there was very little persecution and mostly tolerance from the Visigothic leaders. Here's a little piece from the History of the Goths by Isidore of Seville, and this is the Donini and Ford translation, which was really one of the first translations of this book into English, and it didn't come out until 1966.
Indeed, filled with the madness of the Arian heresy, he stirred up persecution against Catholics and sent very many of the bishops into exile. He removed the revenues and privileges of the churches, and by the acts of terror also compelled many to accept the Arian plague, and deceived many people without persecution by alluring them with gold and gifts. And among the other infections of his heresy, he even dared to rebaptize Catholics, and not only of the common people, but also of the rank of the priestly class, such as Vicentius of Saragossa, who from a bishop, an apostate, and, as it were, was hurled from heaven into hell.
So basically, Leovigild got into conflict with his son Hermenegild, who rebelled against him. Hermenegild was an Arian who converted to Catholicism. Leovigild defeated his son Hermenegild, then exiled him and possibly killed him. Pope Gregory the Great made Hermenegild into a great martyr of the church, even though his death was probably more of a practical nature than a religious one. It worked really well for Pope Gregory the Great to make him into a big martyr. Leovigild was really the first and only Visigothic king to turn up the pressure on Catholics to become Arian, but not quite Arian. Like we said, these Visigoths were semi-Arian at this point. They weren't full-blown, hot-blooded subordinationists of the early 300s. Leovigild was developing something of a compromise position. The Catholics, though, the Catholic hierarchy, they weren't interested. Like we said, some Catholics, even bishops and priests, converted, as we see in this quote, but it was very rare and highly criticized. It really wouldn't matter much, though, because Leovigild's Arian dreams would fade out when he died and his son took over. Even the Arian doxology, it's an important teaching point that they would say was modified under Leovigild to more closely resemble the classical Catholic one, which is in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That he modified it to resemble that more. Moving on, we go to King Recared, Leovigild's son. He converted full-blown to Catholic Christianity in 587, and he finally brought the Visigoths to the church, making the Visigoths the last group, except for the Lombards with asterisks, to convert to Catholicism. Here's a short little quote about that.
In the third year of Mauritius' rule, after the death of Leovigild, his son Ricard was crowned with kingship. He was endowed with reverence for religion and was greatly different from his father in character, for the latter was irreligious and very much opposed to war, while he was devout in his faith and renowned for his love of peace. His father, by skills of war, expanded the rule of his nation, while he, with greater glory, elevated the same nation by the victory of the faith. For at the very beginning of his reign, he embraced the Catholic faith, and after removing the sin of their deep-rooted error, he brought back the people of the whole Gothic nation to reverence for the true faith.
Now here's a little bit from chapter 53 for further explanation.
He then called together a synod of bishops from the various provinces of Spain and Gaul for the condemnation of the Arian heresy. This very religious ruler was present at this assembly and supported its proceedings by his presence and signature. Together with all his subjects, he renounced the falsehood which the nations of the Goths had up to now learned from the teachings of Arius, and proclaimed the unity of the three persons in God, saying that the Son was born from the Father substantially, that the Holy Spirit proceeds inseparably from the Father and the Son, and is one Spirit of both, whence they are one.
Notice how Isidore says, quote, that the Holy Spirit proceeds inseparably from the Father and the Son. In Latin, that is the famous filioque, and will cause great deal of controversy pretty soon. Eventually, the filioque was added to the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed as it's used in the Western Church. This is one of the top factors in the Great Schism between the Western and Eastern Greek Orthodox churches, which was finalized in 1054, but which really was working its way in as early as the 600s and the 700s and the 800s. The Western Church said the filioque was added to the creed to make a strong stand against Arianism. The Eastern Church has said, hey, this wasn't necessary. It changed the fundamental relationship of the Godhead. They also said that the Western Church had no right to change the basic creed of Christianity developed at not one, but two ecumenical councils. The filioque kind of starts here, and it's a controversy that will simmer and eventually boil over. We'll get into it much more from a Western perspective as we proceed. Macabre was very close with Gregory the Great, and Gregory the Great, this was just another Germanic tribe that he could click off that he brought into Christianity. Now, obviously, there was a lot of push and pull factors for Visigoths to become Catholic. Macabre was also pushed, he did push back against Gregory in trying to take too big of a role in church administration in Hispania. Now, we should probably make at least a quick note on what the situation of the Jews were in Hispania at this time, because it is really interesting, and Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula is a topic that will come up time and time again. So let's set the foundation here. There probably wasn't a large population of Jews in Hispania. As in most places, their population was concentrated in a few cities. Isidore of Seville, he wrote about the Jews, but from his writing, you can tell that he almost certainly never met one. As in other places in the Roman and former Roman Empire, there was a mix of persecution and tolerance, which you might call a soft persecution, similar, in fact, to what the Romans had with both the Jews and the Christians, with the exception of the times of serious persecutions, such as the Diocletian persecution. Jews were allowed to own property, but not actively participate in government. So they couldn't, a practicing Jew could not be the member of the town board, for example. And most Jews weren't allowed to hold that kind of power anyways throughout the whole of the breadth of the Roman Empire and former Roman Empire. They could practice their Judaism, but couldn't build new synagogues or repair existing ones. They also couldn't actively try to convert pagans or Christians to Judaism. They also couldn't convert their slaves to Judaism. If they did, the slave was baptized immediately to Christianity and then set free. It's good to set slaves free, but better to really free all slaves too. This was obviously a denial of a generally held property right, though, as much and as loathsome as slavery is, without a doubt. It was this was really based on solely a religious difference, and really in the end, slavery was becoming less common all throughout these areas anyways. Many of these proscriptions against the Jews were later used by the Muslims against the Christians. And really in the broader scope, these prescriptions were fairly universally used against religious minorities all throughout the ancient world and the early medieval world. It's not awesome, but also not unusual. It's often said that the Muslims, when they came in, they brought in a new world of religious tolerance. The short story is, that's absolutely not true. In future episodes, we'll explore why this view is more of a modern fantasy. I'm willing to debate this topic, though. I know there's a lot of people who really hold tight to the convivencia and all that, but I would push back against that, and I will push back against that. We will also explore the development of European anti-Semitism as we move on in the series. Let's quickly talk about something called the Councils of Toledo. The Spanish, Hispania, Romano-Visigothic Church became very rich and powerful very quickly after Record's official adoption of Catholic Christianity. Over the course from the 400s to the late 600s, 18 councils were held in Toledo. Now, Record officially converted the kingdom of the Visigoths to Catholicism at the 11th Council of Toledo. Over the years after this point, the Councils of Toledo became a proto-national parliament. The church and state in Hispania really melded together in a way not seen in other parts of Europe. This will be a major theme in Spanish history for a millennium, and more and more so after this time. Some scholars even call this, what was happening in Hispania at this time, something approaching a theocracy during Visigothic times. Now, many important canons came out of these councils of Toledo. And it's just much more than we can talk about here. I mean, we're talking about 300 years of councils. But really, they were important for both church doctrine and organization of the church all throughout Hispania. To connect this back to the Pope, there's several examples of popes getting involved in the Church of Spain, particularly Gregory the Great, Pope Hormisdas, and then Leo II. Sometimes the church in Hispania accepted these meddlings, if you were, and sometimes they rejected them. There's just so much more history to the Church of Hispania, and then eventually what would become the medieval kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. But as we'll see, as the Visigothic period came to a close, the church and state in Hispania would form a strong bond that would help them take on the Arab conquests and start up the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And this is one of the most interesting, and I'm going to argue the most important times in medieval European history. You'll get so many different takes, interpretations, and tellings of this story as we progress in the history of the Papacy podcast. You will definitely get more of my opinion, and I feel that my opinion's very well grounded in the research, and I think that this will make it more interesting in the conversation to hear my personal views, and there'll be my biases, but I want to have this as a conversation. Hopefully I'll be able to bring on some people who might push back, and we'll have a little debate on this, but I'm really interested to talk about it more, and I really look forward to talking about this whole time period in Western European history. It's just fascinating. I would especially like to hear your questions, comments, and show topics, and I will definitely talk to you you next time on the next stop on our trip of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Rome.